Well, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. Welcome back to the afternoon session of what I think has been already a tremendously successful day. And we want to continue that. And we thank all of you for your continued participation and attendance and engagement with us today. We're going to keep the focus now on Mexico. I think the governor of Veracruz just did a very good job in setting the table for us. Obviously, he had the perspective of his state. We're going to bring the focus back just a little bit now, and we're going to focus on Mexico as a country, Mexico more broadly, and explore some of the issues that perhaps are affecting the investment climate and the environmental climate and some of the other issues from a national perspective. You know, last year, as all of you know, certainly from the Houston community, and you know Mexico so well and the linkages with Mexico are so close, you all know that last year was really a very important year for Mexico, an important year for energy policy in Mexico. You all know that after months, indeed years of debate, the Mexican Congress passed a total of 7 energy reform bills. Obviously, the most debated of those is the legislation that deals with Pemex, Mexico's national oil company. The new legislation allows Pemex, with some limitations, to contract with private firms in exploration and production activities, and it also increases the Secretary of Energy's regulatory power over Pemex, among other things. We have an expert here who I will introduce in just a moment, who's going to be able to talk to us a little bit about that and some other issues as well. And since it's been, at this point, Jed, about 6 months since the reform, or a little bit more, we also have a bit of a track record to see if indeed the reforms that have been put in place are having the intended effect, and if not, what perhaps could be done to strengthen those or to have an even stronger effect. A number of observers, in fact, have questions about the reforms, and have they gone far enough? Did they go too far? And that's some of the things that we want to explore in the panel this afternoon. Of course, the energy sector in Mexico is not just about oil, but it also includes power generation, natural gas, liquid natural gas. We heard some of the alternatives, of course, discussed by the governor in the keynote as well. The recent reforms didn't necessarily address these particular issues, but another one of our speakers does have deep industry expertise and is going to give us an overview of these particular sectors with Mexico, and we're going to have a discussion a little bit about investment in those areas as well. So let me turn to our actual speakers. The first panelist we have is Jed Bailey, who's the Managing Director of the Asia and Latin America Energy Working Groups with CERA. I don't even have to tell any of you what CERA is. You know exactly what they are. In fact, congratulations on your very successful activities over the recent days here in terms of CERA Week. And he's going to talk to us a little bit about the energy reforms in Mexico, and he's going to be followed by Tania Ortiz-Mena, who's the Head of Governmental and Regulatory Affairs for Sempra in Mexico. After each of these speakers gives their comments, we're going to have a little bit of a discussion and a dialogue, and then they will be followed by Paul Isbell, who is the Director of the Energy Program with Spain's Elcano Royal Institute, to give a reaction to what's been said and to take the discussion a little bit further. So with that, we're going to turn to Jed Bailey. Jed, thanks for joining us, and over to you.
Go see the podium or stay here?
Whichever you prefer.
Podium, sitting. All right. Since none of us on this panel actually have slides, we think it might be more comfortable to stay on the panel here and make it more of a dialogue, as I discussed earlier. Yep. So, thank you for that introduction. It is a pleasure to be here and to have this opportunity to share some of CERA's views on the reform and the path we see going forward. And my thought was, since we're here at the Baker Institute here in Rice University, I might frame some of my comments first in an anecdote from my own experience back in university when I was studying mechanical engineering. And in my thermodynamics class, we had a professor who described the 3 laws of thermodynamics in this way. The first law is you can't win. That is, energy in equals energy out. There's no energy gained or lost. The second law is you can't break even. In any finite system, there will always be an increase in entropy, and that means you have losses. The third law of thermodynamics is you can't get out of the game. And that is, there's a hard stop at absolute zero. There's no way to get beyond that. So the 3 laws, you can't win, you can't break even, you can't get out of the game, are actually not a bad way to describe the challenges facing Mexico's energy sector today. And let me give some examples on that. In the can't win category, if you look at oil production outlook and where we see it, especially in the Cantarell field, their major producer, that field is now in structural decline. As a result of that, Mexico's oil production will decline in the foreseeable future, especially in the near term. To put a few numbers behind that, Mexico's oil production peaked in December of 2003. The figure was just above 3.46 million barrels per day. Of that, Cantarell contributed about 2.14. So at its peak, it was approaching 6/10, maybe 2/3 of total production. As Cantarell entered into structural decline and then accelerated dramatically, that has dropped total Mexico oil production down to 2.64 last month, 2.64 million barrels per day. Of that, Cantarell was only 705,000 barrels. So dropped from just over 2 million to well below 1 in just a handful of years. A very significant decline. Certainly there have been other fields coming online, Kumalib-Zap, others that have helped replace some of that loss, but none of them, either in production today or coming on in the next few years, will have the volumes in order to fully replace that decline. And that is a significant challenge for Mexico. In the can't break even category, when you look at the new projects that are in the pipeline and some of the ones that are hoped to be in the pipeline soon, including Chicontepec, the deep water, these areas that have very sizable reserve potential, but are also technically very challenging, and as a result will be very costly. So in the can't break even category, the cost to develop and produce those fields will be far higher than the cost to bring oil out of the ground from Cantarell. In some of the numbers we've looked at, it could be on the order of 3 to 4 times the cost. And that will require far more investment. It will cut dramatically into the profitability and the available revenue coming out of oil production into the future. Again, a very sizable challenge to overcome. And then finally, in the can't get out of the game category, the dynamics that are constraining the sector today are also difficult to change. There are two in particular I want to focus on. One is the government's significant need for these oil revenues. If you look at oil as a percentage of total GDP, it's actually quite minimal. It's on the order of Walmart's contribution, for example. But if you look at its contribution to government revenue, it's potentially a third, or in these recent years with very high oil prices, as much as 40% or even above. So oil revenue is very important for the government's operations and what they can do. And of course, in the economic situation we're in today and in the near future, will be even more important. The second area to look at is the legal restraints, the constitutional, legal, and regulatory restraints on private sector participation in the oil sector. As we look across the world, the more players you get involved, the more different approaches you take to a problem, the more sources of capital you can throw at it. Generally, the quicker you can find solutions, the quicker you can overcome these many barriers. The restrictions on private sector investment, in particular the constitutional restrictions on risk sharing and risk-based contracts, have been a severe hobble for bringing in much of this additional expertise. And there are very good reasons for these restrictions to be there. I don't want to belittle that point, but just to acknowledge that this is one thing that needs to be addressed. And certainly when you look over the reforms of the past few years, that is what they've focused on. How do you address that government reliance, and how do you address those legal and regulatory constraints? So if you look back to the Fox administration, the broad tax reform that was attempted in order to broaden Mexico's tax base, relieve some of that pressure off the oil sector, that was passed but watered down to a point where it didn't have the hoped-for effect. The Pemex fiscal reform of a few years later was trying to limit the budgetary restraints on their ability to spend their capital and retain some of those earnings for their own needs. Again, had some impact, but because they're still under Hacienda's, the Treasury's control, and they're still under congressional budgetary decisions, again, had a limited effect. And so the various reforms and such that were mentioned there bring us to a head of last November, when the big package was passed, culminating in a change to the Pemex the Pemex law, enabling law, completely replaced the 1992 law, and made significant changes to more than half a dozen other supporting and related hydrocarbon laws. What I'd like to do for the rest of my time is focus in on that package of reforms, talk about what was in it, what that might mean for changes for the future as it's implemented, and how that might help Mexico overcome some of those challenges we listed early on. So the main package contained myriad details. I'm going to focus on 5 sort of key areas. The first challenge was the fact that Pemex had very little managerial autonomy. There was lots of interference or help from the government, lots of oversight, lots of overlapping jurisdictions that made it extremely complicated to make decisions. With the new reform, they've been able to increase the flexibility, able to have slightly more efficient budgetary allocation process, which should help them with their own internal processes move more quickly, more nimbly, focus on the problems of the day. A second key challenge was the lack of financial leeway. Their debt and their ability to raise debt was also severely constrained. The vast majority of it run through a program called Pideregas, which came out of the tequila crisis of more than a decade ago. And so with the new system or the new reforms, that debt process is now made more flexible. They introduced the concept of the citizen bonds, which helps bring in potentially a much broader source of financing and source of participation in Pemex's activities that was not available before. Another challenge, their limited procurement capacity. Under the standard government procurement laws, Pemex's process to acquire pencils was the exact same as their one to acquire an offshore drilling rig. And it was extremely cumbersome, extremely difficult to work through. Under this new reform, they've been allowed to create 2 dual regimes, which is incredibly useful. So now they have the standard procurement policies for sort of everything in the background, but they have a new specific system that is separate from the standard procurement, that is specific for those operations or those procurements that are required for their core businesses of E&P, refining, pipelines, and the rest. So that alone should help them be far more flexible and far more able to make the investment decisions they need in a timely manner and then implement them in a timely manner than they were able to before. Next point, restrictive license terms. You could bring in contractors through the old system. There were very strict rules on how they could be remunerated for their efforts, which tended to make those contracts less attractive to most players in the industry. Under the new reform, this is one of the more controversial areas, they're now allowing performance and, to an extent, incentive-based contracts that do recognize, again, to an extent, that companies that are able to go above and beyond the minimum levels of delivery will gain remuneration somewhat equivalent to going above that call of duty. That was not allowed before, and indeed the example has always been, why can't we just pay people per barrel produced? We're allowed to pay people per square foot of wall that they're painting as they're painting our offices. Is it really so much different to link payment to the amount that's being produced from what is being produced? And this has been a very controversial issue, in part because it's seen as one step toward the potential privatization or further opening to the private sector, which is certainly a contentious issue. The final point I wanted to bring out is the owner's fiscal regime, and this directly links to the government's reliance on Pemex for so much of its budget. The new reforms have adapted the term somewhat, and most particularly there's now a special regime for Chicontepec and for the deep water. So these are the areas that will have the highest costs. It would not have been prudent to develop them under the original fiscal regime because the cost to do so would have been prohibitive. The potential payback from doing that would have been quite small. So under these adjusted fiscal regimes, they're able to put off some of the royalty payments and make tackling some of these much more technically challenging areas a little more financially feasible. So in a nutshell, that's the broad impact of what's been done. The reforms are very much focused on strengthening Pemex, making it more able to do what it's been tasked with doing. They have not focused on the private sector question, which was certainly a major part of the debate. To think through sort of how this reform will impact Mexico Energy and Mexico more broadly, I think there are 2 areas to look at. One is the implementation of the reforms. Because remember, they've been only recently passed, as we mentioned. They're moving forward, but they're not fully in place yet. And then a second area to look through is, will it either allow Pemex to make the required investment, or will it allow it to attract the necessary investment from the outside world? To tackle the first, looking at the actual implementation, the time frame started January 1st of this year, just moving forward. A few milestones have been passed, and we're already behind schedule. And most troublesome is that the implementation of the reform is also becoming politicized, much in the same way the debate about the reform, of course, was highly politicized. And the key constraint here, if you will, is the July elections coming up. July 09, Chamber of Deputies up for election. And many of them are very focused on that election, and there are many questions about how the chamber will be constituted following that election. And it's the lower house Chamber of Deputies that's important because they control the purse strings, and so they're the ones who are heavily involved in how you pay for a lot of these implementations, how you allocate the budget for some of the new agencies and new structures that need to be put in place. So to take that line of thought a little bit further, looking at the congressional elections coming up, the current makeup of the chamber, the PAN is the largest party, just over 40%, PRD about 25%, and the PRI has 21%. Of those three major parties, PAN is seeing its popularity falling somewhat, as one would expect, getting into this stage of the incumbent president's term of office. The incumbent party is also feeling some of the frustration of the slow pace of change and implementation of what was promised during the elections. However, we're also seeing the PRD, which was the main opposition during the election, is also seeing their popularity falling. And the ones benefiting from both of those is the PRI, who's been able to position itself to an extent as the kingmaker, sort of in between, putting its support to which of those two polar opposites it feels most comfortable with or sees the most benefit. And so there's a very slim chance and a very unlikely chance that the PAN will have a full majority of greater than 50% post the election. There's a very good chance that the PRI will become the second largest party, and therefore will have an even greater role in helping to direct the agenda and the shaping of this implementation as we go forward. So then thinking somewhat longer term, will it allow the investment that's needed? And again here, it's a question of the constitutional and legal constraints which are still there and the timing. The implementation of this reform will take quite a while. The implementation of investments to come from that reform will then take time, and then the actual production of oil from those investments that come from this reform will take even longer. So it's a very long time, especially for politicians, to wait to see the benefit of what they've done after they've taken the pain of actually pushing through the reform that they've done. So that bodes ill for the future. In particular, the constitutional limitations, when we look at what's available for the private sector outside of Pemex, it's most attractive to service companies, local Mexican companies. The large international oil companies will unlikely find this attractive in the state it's in today. Our view is that further reform is necessary. This was an important step along that road, but it is one step along a road. And it's important to see what can come next, to see where this process will take us, and if at a few more steps down the road we can get to a point where terms are available that are both acceptable to the Mexican authorities and the Mexican people, and also acceptable to outside companies to invest. So we mentioned a need for a few more steps. What's the possibility of seeing those in the near term? Again, we think highly unlikely. The current reform obviously has to be implemented first. That will take time. In addition to that, Congress has an overloaded agenda. With the economic crisis engulfing much of the world, there are many, many other things taking up their attention that rightly have priority, and so will delay things further. And as a result, most of the politicians that we're looking at are highly risk averse, thinking very carefully about the elections in the near term, the elections in 2012 and beyond. And so we don't see a lot of appetite for someone to step out of what is seen as broad public opinion today to try and push the agenda much more radically. So to end on a slightly less downbeat note, if we get back to those three laws that I started with, as I mentioned, production's falling, costs are going up. As we see across the world, oil prices are also falling. And we also see the need of government for revenue is increasing dramatically with the economic crisis. All of those sound quite bad, but the combined effect is the pressure for change is growing quite dramatically. A crisis does have the effect of focusing attention quite quickly. And so as things get worse, the potential for change increases. Now, the flip side of that is the lack of political consensus and drivers today. We do believe things will get worse before they get better. Given the delays that I mentioned before and the time frame it will take to implement all this, we think things will get much worse before they get better. But I should say that, in separation from my analogy earlier in the three laws of thermodynamics, these three factors that we see, these three areas of concern, are not immutable. They're not fixed in stone the way laws of thermodynamics are. All three of these are changeable. Production levels, cost, both affected by investment, technology, and the rest. It's if we can get the framework and the underlying policies in place to allow that to move forward, regardless of who it is that's driving it, private or public sector. These are surmountable problems. Our view is it will take time, but we do believe that it will get there eventually.
Very good. Thank you for those comments. I'll tell you, I can't remember the last panel I was on that the three laws of thermodynamics were discussed. In fact, I'm strictly a liberal arts major. I can't even spell MIT, Jed. So the fact of the matter is you added some depth to the conversation that we very much appreciate. We're going to turn to Tanya for a discussion of the non-oil sector in Mexico.
Thank you, Eric. I would like to thank the Council of the Americas for inviting me to speak at this event. As you could tell from Jed's presentation, the energy reform that was recently passed in Mexico was not a comprehensive energy reform. It was really an oil reform, although it does include a limited renewables initiative, but it was really an oil reform, and I would actually say it's a Pemex reform, not even an entire oil industry reform. So the picture would not be complete without talking about natural gas and electricity in Mexico. The electricity sector was reformed in 1992 when private investment was allowed in a limited way in electricity generation, and the natural gas sector was reformed in 1995 when private investment was allowed in natural gas infrastructure. Sempra Energy, for those of you not familiar with the company that I represent, is one of the few companies that have actively invested, in these areas of the industry, electricity generation and gas infrastructure. Today, the company has invested a little over $2 billion in infrastructure in Mexico. We are a U.S.-based company. We own two gas utilities in California, Southern California Gas and San Diego Gas and Electric, and we also own generation and gas infrastructure assets throughout the U.S. and Latin America. So, as I mentioned, in 1992, the Electricity Public Service Law was amended to allow private participation only in electricity generation in different modalities through the independent private producer scheme, cogeneration, self-use, and exports. However, all of the electricity from these IPPs and all the excess electricity from the cogeneration plants, the export facilities, and the self-use facilities have to be sold to the Comisión Federal de Electricidad, the state-owned electric utility. All of the transmission lines are owned and controlled by CFE, and all of the distribution is also done by CFE, and there is another, a small state-owned utility in central Mexico called Luz y Fuerza del Centro. So although the areas to which private investment was open was very limited, and it was mainly due to the fact that Mexico was perceived as being increasingly unable to meet growing electricity demand back in 1992, so private investment was opened in electricity generation. From 1992 to date, Mexico has an additional 30,000 megawatts of capacity that's all privately owned. So from that perspective, the program was extremely successful. Out of the 30,000 megawatts, about 15,000 megawatts is electricity sold to CFE through the IPP scheme, and the rest is self-use, cogeneration, and export projects. Today, Mexico has about a reserve margin in terms of electric capacity of over 40%. So right now, if anything, our problem is that we have too much, we have excess installed capacity in Mexico, which is not a bad problem to have. But in terms of going forward and looking at potential business opportunity, of course, I mean, in Mexico today, electricity generation is not a priority. So we do foresee some new plants being built in the renewable area, maybe 2 new wind projects, 100 megawatts each in the Oaxaca area. There's a push for geothermal. A plant in Baja California is being expanded, and another in central Mexico. Baja California responding mainly to California's renewable energy requirements, but we don't foresee a lot of interesting opportunities in this area due to the excess reserve margin. In the natural gas area, the reform was wider. In 1995, regulatory law of Constitutional Article 27 was amended to allow private investment in natural gas, transportation, distribution, and storage, as well as marketing activities. So as a result, the Energy Regulatory Commission was created, and today there are 21 gas distribution companies in different urban areas. Investment in gas distribution is a bit over $1.8 billion today. There's also been some interesting investment in natural gas transportation. Investment is a little over $2 billion, mainly open access pipelines. And in storage, Mexico, although Mexico does not have any natural gas underground storage, Mexico moved very early on in this recent wave of LNG facilities when it was determined that North America would no longer be able to supply its natural gas needs, and it was really isolated from the rest of the world. So Mexico first built an LNG facility in the Gulf Coast in Altamira. That's a terminal owned by Shell, Total, and Mitsui, which is half a BCF, has half a BCF capacity. Another plant in the Pacific, which is owned by Sempra, has a 1 BCF capacity, an LNG receipt terminal, and a third terminal was recently built in the southern Pacific of the Mexican coast in Manzanillo, which will be supplied out of Peru from Repsol, and the facility was built by a joint venture between Korea Gas, Mitsui, and Samsung. So with regards to potential investment opportunities in the natural gas sector, Mexico is badly in need of reinforcing its natural gas pipeline system. To begin with, I mean, bids that are currently in place. A pipeline is needed from the Manzanillo LNG terminal to take the gas that will be purchased by CFE from Repsol to central Mexico to Guadalajara. That's about a 500 million cubic feet a day pipeline, 300 kilometers, so that they are interesting projects. There's another project in central Mexico for a pipeline similar size. And there's at least one other pipeline going from the state of Veracruz to central Mexico to take the gas that will be coming out of the Chicontepec fields to central Mexico, and another border interconnection needed in the Chihuahua area. So there are also Mexico, and in particular the Energy Regulatory Commission, is particularly concerned about the lack of redundancy in the national pipeline system. Mexico is a very, thin and long country, if you can call it that. So our pipeline system is very linear, and we don't have any redundancy in the system. So we need, there may be, or we foresee regulatory changes in the very near future to allow those redundancy pipelines to be built. In order for those pipelines to be built, we expect a new rate mechanism to be put in place for rolled-in rate, which would basically incorporate the cost of those new pipelines into the Pemex national pipeline system, which could also bring interesting business opportunities. However, I mean, of course, although these two changes, the 1992 change in law and the 1995 change in the law, did bring an interesting amount of private investment in Mexico, there are also serious limitations to allowing private investment to grow in Mexico and to continue meeting our energy needs through this legal framework. With regards to electricity, of course, CFE continues to be the main participant. An electricity market does not exist in Mexico. CFE also controls the transmission network. The regulator does not control the transmission network or transmission rates, which is, I think, it obviously does not promote efficiency. And also another problem for CFE is that CFE's electricity rates are subsidized. They're used as a way to redistribute income. And therefore, it's very, very hard for CFE to think in terms of efficiency where it has this mixed instructions. With regards to CFE's renewable portfolio, although there are some new initiatives in place which in theory state that Mexico will move towards renewable energy, CFE's mandate by law is to buy the lowest cost electricity, which means that it'll be very difficult to see CFE building solar or even wind without special funding, such as the IDB funding that was mentioned earlier today. In fact, Sempra Energy is looking at building a wind facility in Baja California, 200 megawatt facility. However, we expect most of that electricity to end up in the California market, where the cost of that electricity is recognized, because it is very difficult for CFE to buy electricity from renewable projects because of costs. With regards to natural gas, Pemex, of course, continues to have a predominant role, although the regulations do establish clear limitations for Pemex in natural gas. Those regulations, it's been a little over 10 years after the regulations were enacted, have been unable to be 100% enforced on Pemex. So Pemex continues to control all of its pipeline capacity. They continue to undertake most marketing activities. So in reality, the conditions are not there to compete against Pemex. Most investments happen in places where Pemex is not interested at all and not involved at all. And another key problem for natural gas infrastructure is a very unfair pricing mechanisms. Natural gas is one of the few fuels in Mexico which is actually directly linked to international markets. However, all other alternative fuels are controlled, and we're seeing constant interventions on behalf of the government. LPG, for example, is controlled. It's another form of distributing subsidies to the lower income households. Gasoline prices were also recently controlled. So it's very difficult to find private investors to invest in Mexico when there's uncertainty as to whether the fuel they're selling will be able to compete with other fuels. One of the problems of the sector also is that the regulator, the Energy Regulatory Commission, has very, very limited resources, and we've seen constant political intervention in the institution. So it's not, the institution has been unable to be 100% independent and develop long-term policies in the benefit of the sector. The last thing that's yet to be seen in Mexico is the impact of the economic crisis on energy and natural gas demand. We believe that the government figures do not yet clearly show the impact of the economic slowdown on natural gas and electricity demand, so we'll need to see how that affects new projects going ahead. Thank you.
Well, there are about 100 ways I'd like to follow up with both of these presentations and explore some of the topics that have been raised, but that privilege actually goes to our discussant, Paul Isbell, who I'm going to ask to come to the podium and give us his comments. And as he's coming, I wanted to once again thank the Baker Institute and Amy and Erica, but I also wanted to thank from the Council of the Americas and the American Society, Nicole Spencer, who has done all the work and frankly allowed some of the rest of us just to take the credit, but she's the one who actually deserves the plaudits and the kudos. So Nicole, thank you for your good work. Paul.
Thank you, Eric. I think the first thing I learned at this conference early on, in the first session actually, listening to Lawrence Whitehead intervene as the discussant, I learned that I am definitely of the Lawrence Whitehead school of discussants, in that I will be giving my comments on the hoof as well, for no other reason than it's difficult to respond so quickly. It's more difficult for me simply because I'm not as good as Lawrence Whitehead. Nothing can be done in the short term about that. Also, I only learned a few days ago that I was shifted from one of the other panels to the Mexico panel. It's probably, given my background, the least appropriate panel to put me on, of any here today, or to have me speak about any situation on energy in Latin America. Nevertheless, I couldn't say no to the invitation from the Baker Institute and the Council for the Americas, given that I've been waiting for so long to come to the Baker Institute and to perhaps begin some links between my energy program at the Elcano Institute in Madrid and the Baker Institute. So I suppose I have to earn my keep, that beautiful suite I was given at the hotel, by saying something of marginal value, even if it's nothing more than the critical distance of someone who doesn't know Mexico that well. Nevertheless, I thought the Mexican situation was outlined very well by Jed, particularly in the oil sector. The 3 laws of thermodynamics, I will definitely use that one in future talks. I mean, the story seems to be fairly clear. Declining production, the reserve situation uncertain, investment in danger of stagnating, exports declining, imports, particularly in gas, potentially rising, even though electricity demand is currently being met. Future problems meeting demand coming up around the corner, and enormous infrastructure requirements in both the oil and gas sectors and in the electricity area. Now, if I were to take this critical distance and consider the situation in Mexico, no less so in the energy realm, from my perspective, my first reaction would be to think that it's not the future doesn't have to be that bleak. The one thing I have noticed about Mexico in the last 20 years or so is that, like Brazil, in a certain sense, and this ties back to some of the comments made by Lawrence Whitehead, like Brazil, Mexico has been able to avoid violent swings between one ideological orientation or another. There's been a rise in pragmatic outlooks on governance. The energy sector has not catapulted back and forth between a focus on private sector activity, liberalization, openness, only to swing back to a more closed nationalistic stance. Right? So some of the problems we've seen, or just the instability we've seen in some of the other Latin American countries with respect to their energy policy and their models, we haven't seen it in Mexico. As a matter of fact, many have made the argument, like my colleague in Spain, Javier Santiso, who's now the chief economist of the Development Center at the OECD, in a recent book that he wrote that was called The Political Economy of Pragmatism, makes the argument that much of the progress that we seem to have been able to put our finger on in Latin America in the last generation, particularly in a few of the big economies, like Brazil, like Chile, and Santiso throws Mexico into the same bag. He argues it's precisely because politics has become de-ideologized, if the word exists. There has been a concomitant rise in pragmatism, particularly from parts of the political spectrum that were more radical or had a more socialist vision or a more nationalist vision, and that they've taken the lead, and that we've seen the steady accumulation of reforms, the steady accumulation of institution building. We've seen continuity, and I think Brazil is the showcase for this. But the argument can be made in many ways for Mexico as well. Now, the big difference between a Brazil, particularly in the energy realm, and a Mexico, even if in other areas of economic evolution and the evolution of the body politique we see similarities, is that the attitude towards energy, towards hydrocarbons in particular, has always been very different in a Brazil than it has been in Mexico. In Brazil, as far as I can see, we've never really had a very intense historical, emotional, national attachment to for the people or the state to control, to own, control, and to manipulate the hydrocarbon sector. As a matter of fact, before the Cardoso-Lula evolution of the reform of the energy model, indeed, the state, like the rest of the commanding heights of the economy, had a controlling hand over energy, but that was just the way things were done. And once we saw this pragmatic shift start to accumulate in Brazil, there was really no special emotional resistance to the partial privatization of Petrobras. Now, when we look at Mexico, it seems to me that we have an excessive amount of continuity in the energy sector and with the energy model, and we have this unique characteristic in Mexico, this historic emotional attachment to the state ownership of oil and state control over its use, regulation of the sector, etc., which does place Mexico in the sense that it does show signs of continuity. It does show signs of stability and gradual incremental change, like some of the other more successful Latin American economies. It also is in a unique category by itself with respect to its attitude towards the energy sector. Now, if I were to react to the way I have read about the reforms in Mexico, the recent reforms, and listening to Jed speak about them, I noticed that he tried to give a kind of optimistic, I thought it was a more optimistic description of what's happening and what potential there is. To me, it appears that these are very incremental, very marginal changes. And I would personally probably say way too incremental and way too marginal. And I understand the restrictions, the limitations that we're all aware of, that Jed laid out very clearly. But I would also add something further to this. Jed did mention that the original Calderon proposals for the reform that were put forward early last year were seen by broad swaths of the opposition in the PRD and parts of the PRI as a kind of first step towards liberalization, privatization, and opening. And so therefore fought fiercely to claw back or to water down even these marginal reforms. And the reforms that we see in Mexico today, as they're beginning to be implemented, have some room for the private sector, but it's marginal. But nevertheless, my perception is that the way this is seen on the left in Mexico, again, PRD and large parts of the PRI, is that this still really is the opening for further reform. And the danger, and this is a thesis that I've picked up from our colleague David Mares in one of his recent papers on Mexico, the danger is that if these reforms are unsuccessful in attracting sufficient IOC activity, which is perceived by a broad swath of the Mexican public as useful and constructive, if there is no response from the international community, then the perception could be that there you see, the IOCs aren't interested if they can't enter Mexico on their own terms. And this could lay the groundwork or the path for a potential backlash the next time we have a round of energy reform after the next elections. Now, given all of that, it's difficult for me personally to see the way forward for Mexico in the energy realm if we want to see reserves increase, production rise, investment backing it up. One might think, however, and I think Jed hinted this at the end of his talk, that perhaps a crisis would be the sufficient detonator for change to provide a stimulus for deeper energy reform in Mexico. The kind of reform that many of us think could potentially resolve many of the current problems in the Mexican energy sector. Now, I see that there are two ways to answer that question, two schools of thought. In any event, one could say that Mexico, it seems, will just have to learn it the hard way, but that they will learn. This would be the same school of thought that Javier Santiso analysis falls into, or even David Mares' analysis in the same sense, that the current economic crisis, and not just the effect of lower oil prices and lower revenues and falling production, but the economic crisis which is spilling into Mexico, that the crisis itself will generate, will break the back of resistance to reform in Mexico where it still needs to occur, perhaps the energy sector. One could look to past economic crises in Mexico for antecedents. The 70s and 80s crisis that did pave the way to modify previous land reform in Mexico. The 94-95 crisis, which paved the way for banking and financial sector reform. So you could take this optimistic line that crisis will breed enough of a change, of a mix in the political economy to provoke the necessary reforms. I find it hard to be optimistic about that because the opposite could happen. The resistance to reform could be increased by the current economic crisis, particularly if it gets worse, and it looks like it will. And I say that because the current crisis, quite frankly, is very different than the crisis that Mexico would have experienced in the late 70s and across the 90s, or even the tequila crisis in 94-95. The kind of crises which Santiso said eventually shake up the political economy enough to lead to sufficient reform that then becomes gradual, consistent, continuous, and stable. That's simply because this is a world crisis. This is a world crisis with its epicenter here in the United States. And it's a world crisis which is actually questioning the legitimacy of the very economic ethic, liberal economics, upon which the further and deeper Mexican reforms rely. So what do we think is going to happen in the political landscape of Mexico as a result of deepening world economic crisis? Will the PRD and the recalcitrant branches of the PRI decide that economic crisis is making things bad enough in Mexico to allow for a liberalization and opening of the energy sector, or even continue incrementally in that direction? Or would we be willing to bet that the economic crisis is actually going to strengthen the idea in the minds of many people in Mexico that it is this very economic philosophy and ethic which is behind the current world crisis? And that's where I see it difficult to see beyond. Now, I will say one more thing before I conclude, and this has to do with the role of the United States. Like so many other aspects of energy issues, which I find typically are not intuitive, the solutions are not intuitive, they're counterintuitive. I think that maybe the way that Mexico might eventually achieve deeper reform in the energy sector will not come as a result of new changes in Mexico, but the stimuli will come from outside, particularly given what our panelists have told us about the electoral cycle and the unlikelihood that there will be enough of a critical mass to do anything more important in the energy realm before the next elections. But those elections, or this period before those elections, is precisely the period in which we have the first term of the Obama administration here in the United States. And I think that if deeper reform in Mexico is going to gain credibility and legitimacy amongst enough Mexicans for it to have success, it probably means that the United States and American actors, American oil companies, have to gain more legitimacy in the eyes of Mexico. And for that to happen, I think the United States policy in general towards in issues which impinge upon Mexico much more importantly than energy policy also have to change. So I think that probably the most likely path for future deeper energy reform will be an indirect, counterintuitive evolution of affairs in which the United States begins to make serious progress on other policy areas which affect Mexico very deeply. And we don't need to debate these necessarily right now, but we all know that there's immigration policy, drug policy, arms policy, etc. Now, fortunately, we have a new administration in the United States which probably has more political capital than any administration in recent memory, and maybe they'll do something about this. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. You heard it here first. Paul Isbell talked about the first Obama administration. That means there will be a second Obama administration. Just trying to see if people are paying attention out there. We have approximately 10 or 15 minutes for follow-up questions, but here we go. That's the chair we're looking for. Thank you. But before we open the floor, I want to give the opportunity to both of our panelists to respond very briefly to anything that might have already been said by one of their other panelists. There were some points of divergence in some of the conversation, and that's good. Because if everybody saw the world the same way, I think I'm not sure how interesting the world would be. So I'm going to give first the floor to Jed for any response. And again, please just a short comment if there was anything in particular you wanted to respond to, and then we'll open it up to the audience. Sure.
And maybe just a quick comment on the point you were making about political pragmatism, which I think is actually spot on. It's a very interesting point. And especially in the case of Brazil and other countries that have been able to have that policy continuity across different regimes is very interesting. And I would make 2 points along those same lines. One is that I think the Fox administration was probably the best thing that could have happened to the PRI at the time because it forced them to define who they were. In the past, it was like the Communist Party in Russia. If you were in politics, you were in the PRI by definition. And so it was a very, very big tent. It was encompassing everything. And so they spent an administration deciding who they are and what they want to be, and are starting to sort that out. And so along the lines that you were saying, I think that gives some comfort that should the PRI take power again, there may still be continued continuity along those lines. The caution I would add is, if you remember the election just recently, AMLO lost by a very narrow margin. Indeed, many would say he didn't lose. And so he was promoting a very dramatic shift away from the continuity that would have seen from Zedillo to Fox to the current administration. So I think that the potential is definitely there for that continuity to continue, but I think the potential is there for it to not as well. Very good. Tanya, what about that? You live in Mexico. You see this from a daily basis. What about...
Well, I would like to reflect on the issue of crude prices. Mexico's crude production peaked in 2004. However, we didn't seem to notice because of crude prices. And you would, so in a way, the worst thing that could happen to the Calderon initiative for energy reform was high crude prices, because Mexico was not yet feeling the impact of lower crude production. You would expect us to be feeling it today, and maybe Congress people having second thoughts about the very limited energy reform that they approved. However, fortunate for Mexico in the short term, the Ministry of Finance hedged oil prices back in September at $80 per barrel. So again, we have not yet felt the impact of the lower crude prices. So I think for Mexico, in this sense, it's a very important year. We have this year to reflect on how the government will handle much lower government revenues starting in 2010 as a result of lower crude production and lower oil prices. And we have a huge benefit of being able to prepare for it. We know that it's coming, but we have a year to prepare for it. So it would be interesting to see how the government decides to balance its budget, or that's probable, but if they decide to go ahead with a second round of energy reforms next year.
That's a very good point. I'm glad you raised it. Paul, any response to the responses? And if not, we'll open it up to the floor.
Well, I think the comment that Tanya just made is very important thing to note, that any economic pain that's being felt in Mexico now and that will be felt over the next months is, along your lines of argumentation, it has nothing really to do right now with the crisis in the energy sector, or at least in the income generating part of the hydrocarbon sector. It's economic. Now, on the other hand, imagine if the scenario were different. Imagine if we just had a drop in oil prices, but it wasn't linked to a sharp contraction of global demand from this global financial crisis, which has become a global recession, and you just had the drop in oil prices. I could therefore see a different way this would be consumed internally in Mexico, with a different impact on the perceived need of deeper reforms. I mean, after all, we've all talked about independent of the global business cycle, which we often forget still does exist, and I think we've all been reminded recently that it does. As far as Hugo Chavez's regime in government, let's say in Venezuela goes, we've always pinned his longevity on where the oil prices were. So I think that, unfortunately, Mexico is going to feel the strains that are coming, not in the short term from the energy sector, but from a much larger global economic conflagration, which is having the impact of hacking away at the credibility of global economic liberalism, and therefore at the justifications for all of those, really useful and productive reforms where they were made in Latin America over the last 20 years. And that's the danger that I see in this cocktail.
Okay, we have time for one round of questions. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take 2 or 3 questions all at once. So we don't have a lot of time. We're going to start right here, Dr. Whitehead, and then we're going to the extent
under the pressure of crisis, it's possible that reforms will be taken that will lead to an increase in energy output, but we've heard all the reasons why that might not happen. There is the alternative that the pressure of crisis could also produce other policy changes which might be just as helpful and easier politically to do. I'm thinking of energy saving. We heard Juan Pablo Bonilla talking earlier on, for example, about this fideicomiso, which for a small amount of money had produced a very remarkable improvement in energy efficiency. I think he referred to electricity generation, so I'll address this to Tanya. But more generally, I'm wondering how much scope you think there is for saying, oh dear, we can't get our output up for these reasons, so that means we should redouble our efforts to use more efficiently the energy that we do have.
Very good. Before you answer that, there's a question right here. I want to take these as a round so that we can all answer them all at once, so that we don't delay the last panel too much.
Okay, I have a question for Tanya. there isn't much electricity trade between Mexico and the United States. There's a ton between Canada and the United States. Mexico is right next to California. As you said, we in California need a lot of electricity. So I wondered if you could say something about the obstacles to electricity trade between the U.S. and Mexico, at least in the Southwest.
Outstanding question. Outstanding question. And the third and final question, is there one? Right here, please.
Thank you. Have you explored the possibility of the problem that poses the Mexico government reliance on Pemex revenues? If the government could have another source of income, maybe Pemex could redirect its oil earnings and invest in technology and infrastructure like maybe Petrobras. Have you explored that possibility?
Very good. So we have the three questions are in terms of the pricing mechanism in Mexico, and will that lead to other changes perhaps in terms of the energy mix, perhaps in terms of conservation, efficiencies, that sort of thing. We have the question of electricity trade between the United States and Mexico, and we have the I'm sorry, I just blanked on your question.
Other source of government income.
Other source of government income, thank you. Thank you, in terms of Pemex and the national budget. So Tanya, why don't we start with you? We'll go to Jed and we'll give Paul the last word.
Okay, well, with regards to energy efficient, President Calderon in particular and Secretary of Energy Kessel, I think they're both very serious about energy efficiency. Again, renewables were not competitive to begin with, lower oil prices, less competitive, so why not think about energy efficiency? And there's a lot of room for improvement in Mexico. Mexico is starting with smaller scale initiative, which appear to make sense. There's, for example, a program to exchange your old refrigerator. You get a bonus to exchange your old refrigerator for a new refrigerator. So very simple things, solar panels in a new low-income housing developments. So small scale initiatives that can go a long way. But with regards to energy efficiency, I think there's a long way to go, especially for Pemex. And where I'm not necessarily seeing that much activity there, although there are some initiatives to build, for example, cogeneration plants. So one in Ciudad Pemex in Tabasco. But the Pemex, for example, we flare a lot of natural gas. The December figures showed Pemex flaring over 1 billion cubic feet a day of natural gas. I mean, that's equivalent to close to a total country natural gas import. So Pemex now is looking at capturing that natural gas and reinjecting it into Gulf Coast crude production. But I think, there's a lot that can be done in Pemex in particular. CFE, on the contrary, CFE CEO, who has been head of CFE for over 10 years now, maybe over close to 12 years, I think. He believes in energy efficiency more than focusing on renewables, because that, although we are working on hydrants and wind projects, as I mentioned, CFE is also focusing on energy efficiency. So Mexico is taking some limited but very proactive initiatives in this sense. With regards to electricity exchange in the Southwest, Mexico, in Baja California, I would say Baja California electricity generation capacity is probably about a little over 2,000 megawatts, and I would say almost over 1,000 megawatts of that is being exported into the U.S. So that market is very, very active. The power plants are interconnected and are part of the California transmission system. So they're basically one more participant in that market. So in that area of the country, the exchange is very, very active. Do you want to talk about budget?
Sure. Yeah. No. Well, touch on the energy efficiency and the budgetary question to it a little bit, and thinking along the lines of ways that you could improve efficiency, especially where it might impact, and I'll focus on the oil sector, The trick within Mexico, like most of the world, is it's the transportation sector where the vast majority of the oil is consumed. And as many know, Mexico is actually importing a lot of gasoline specifically to feed its automotive fleet. And improving efficiency there, while it's certainly possible and certainly technology is available, it tends to be more expensive. And in a country like Mexico, where automobile penetration is relatively low, as you bring in newer, more efficient vehicles, it doesn't necessarily displace older or less efficient, it just provides them out to other people who can now afford them. So what you get is a much deeper penetration of automobiles, but lesser of an impact on the actual overall efficiency of the system. So there's a lot of tricky aspects to that. When we've looked at this question within CERA, one of the things we're paying a lot of attention to are plug-in hybrid electric vehicles. We tend to be very skeptical about a lot of new automobile technologies. The plug-in hybrids seem to be quite interesting, especially in the context of the United States. Whether that can translate to Mexico to take advantage of the surplus generation capacity that Tanya was mentioning, again, is uncertain because those vehicles will be much more expensive per unit than a typical gasoline-engined vehicle, which makes it very difficult to promote their penetration. But it's an option that could be interesting, especially in small markets, or not small markets, but in very localized markets like Mexico City, for example. To touch on the income question, certainly the best way to do that would be to expand the tax base as wide as possible. One way to do that is a higher or a better enforced income tax, but that's difficult politically. Another option is to increase the value-added tax or expand what it covers. Again, difficult, especially in this environment, to raise the cost of everything for everyone. One thing that could be considered that also ties into the energy efficiency would be a specific energy tax. There is currently a tax on gasoline that essentially it's a variable tax that allows the retail price to stay flat as the input oil prices are fluctuating. You could increase that. In recent years, when oil prices were so high, it actually was a subsidy for a while in order to maintain that flat retail. You could increase that, which would reduce gasoline consumption, act as an incentive for greater efficiency, and also remove some of those pressures on the government budget. The main problem with that is it's hugely regressive. It's the poorest parts of society that pay the highest share of their income for transportation, for heating, for other energy uses. And so it would essentially shift the tax burden down in society away from the more affluent toward the poorer parts, which again is not necessarily desirable and certainly not politically attractive. But certainly if you're going to get away from the reliance on oil, you've got to find another source or spend less, both of which are tough to do in any country.
Very good. Paul.
I'll just say a few things about the income question as well. I concur with everything that Jed had to add there. I just think it's worth underlining the fact that it's not just that the Mexican state has an excessive reliance on the income from hydrocarbons. The Mexican state has basically no tax base, and it's not just that it's low, right? It's not just a low percentage of GDP. I think it is one of the lowest in all of Latin America. It's lower than the Latin American average, around 12 or 13% in Mexico, something like this. Now, I don't subscribe even to the discussion on Mexico as a failed state, but something has to be done here, and this is one reflection of the oil curse. When for all of the dynamics in the domestic economy and the perceptions of political constituents, when oil is seen as as sufficient, and therefore there's no support for creating a real modern fiscal system. And again, I understand the domestic political constraints, and I'm not quite sure I see the way out of it.
Well, I would love the opportunity to continue this conversation. Unfortunately, we are at time, so we're going to have to call it here. But before we dismiss to the next panel. I believe, Amy, you're going to be the next person coming on up here. But let's please give a round of warm applause and appreciation to our terrific panelists.